I'm a kind of an old school PowerPoint user, so this presentation deal is new to me. I'll endeavor to persevere, though. So certainly it's a pleasure to get to talk about a recent event. It was interesting to hear some of the comments related to secure food supply plans and the thought processes behind, depopulation and what are we going to do with all those animals. And so here's an event where it was a natural disaster, but we certainly had the opportunity to think about some things on a large scale. And as I'll talk about, we ended up with 30,000 head of mortalities with this event. So that in the real world, in a disease outbreak in the Texas Panhandle, would be a very small drop in the bucket in the terms of the number of animals we'd have to deal with. But I want to talk about kind of the progression and some things that happened, and then also certainly talk about some lessons learned. And I'm going to try not to take up all more than 2 or 3 hours because I know we've got a reception to get to tonight. So those of you that know me know that brevity is not necessarily my strong suit, so I'll try to breeze through some of this. So Winter Storm Goliath, and for the next couple of slides, some of this information, for those of you from the colder climes, this is not going to be that event, not newsworthy, but it is for the part of the world that we were dealing with and where this occurred. So this started the day after Christmas, December 26th. Dr. Yacht from Canyon was certainly a participant in this storm just by location. But, the snow started falling, and it's not uncommon for that part of the world to get some snow. It happens. What was interesting about this, though, is you start looking at these maps and see the numbers there again. Those of you from the colder parts of the world say, 15 inches of snow. That's a big deal. 11 inches of snow in that part of the world can be a big deal. The other thing that goes with that part of the world is the wind never stops blowing, and that was certainly the biggest contributing factor to what transpired and what caused all the problems with Winter Storm Goliath is the wind. So here's a picture of, this is an FFA project barn at one of the schools in the Texas Panhandle, and you can see that there was a little bit of wind associated with this 3, 4, 5, 8 inches of snow that blew in from the side and through the windows and completely covered areas and mostly covered the rest of it. So that's just one indicator. So when I talk about wind, the wind blew 40 miles an hour the whole time during the storm and gusted to 80. And so it set up a perfect situation for some incredible drifting activity. The drifts were 10 to 14 feet deep. In a lot of places they were deeper than that. In some we had reports of drifts in excess of 20 feet. And there were activities associated with preparing for this storm. The producers were doing some things they thought were the appropriate things to do. We have not had one of these storms like this in the Texas Panhandle since the big dairy operations moved in. So they were doing some things to try to help their animals out with this situation. But part of what they were doing was setting up some windbreaks and some things like that, which really were a detriment in this case because they established some areas where the drifts to get really deep. And that's what caused a lot of the mortality issues, especially on the dairies, was these cattle were getting behind there and then getting covered with snow. So one of the things, though, that the wind did help out with was in terms of the animals that were out on range or out on pastures, it did keep the grazing areas clear. There wasn't that much accumulation of snow there, but anywhere where there was a fence, it drifted. And so the animals that were out, and I'll talk about this in just a minute, they started to move quite large distances because there was nothing to stop them. They just drifted with the wind, so to speak. So, well, the lighting is terrible, and so this is an emergency management presentation here. So I had some of these pictures. I took out the really gruesome ones, but some of them are, I'm going to show some pictures of mortality. So I just forewarn you. That is a picture of a barn. They've dug down here next to it in a drift. And there's actually a cow laying. There's several actually. There's one laying right here, and then you can see the parts of another one. You can't see this picture at all with these lights, but that just demonstrates what the drifts look like up against the buildings. And again, that's what part of the biggest issue is with the mortalities in this storm was the drifting part of it. Yeah, that's some of these pictures we may not be able to see very well. So the storm was occurring, and we knew it was going on. Certainly from an emergency management perspective, the Texas Division of Emergency Management was doing their thing related to the people issues. We really didn't hear that much about it from the Texas Animal Health Commission perspective until the evening of the 27th or so. We started seeing some things on social media and getting a few calls from our local inspectors that said, it's a pretty good storm. There's cattle beginning to get out and drift. And these are pictures of cattle that were in the Lubbock area, that were in a feed yard outside of Lubbock, that after the drifting occurred, they just walked out of the feed yard. And this picture is really good. This is Loop 289, and so this is an interstate situation. This is 2 and 3 lanes of interstate traffic. It's a loop around Lubbock, Texas, and these cattle are just walking down the loop. So that was kind of the first time that we heard anything about what was going on. And so about the 29th, when it started settling down, we in southeast of Lubbock, where there was an area where a lot of the stocker cattle are, it was really hard hit in terms of snow and wind. We started getting calls or information that there were a large number of displaced cattle, and I mean displaced by 40 miles. And we actually had one of our employees who's a horseback responder respond to that situation, and he got out a horseback with a lot of the local producers and went to trying to find these cattle, put them into pens to hold them anywhere they could, including the newly renovated Little League fields and everywhere else that they could find that had a decent fence. So you can see there early on that there was quite a bit of snow. That's a really good picture of his personal truck and trailer, and that was very early on in the day. Because that rig ended up being pulled around by a big four-wheel drive John Deere tractor before it was all said and done. There was no other way to get it around. So, again, the storm was such that nobody really knew what the impact was, especially on the dairies, until after it blew over and the producers were able to get into their premises on the 29th and 30th. And we started getting information about what the mortality picture looked like. We didn't know at that point. The feed yards had a little bit better idea than what the dairies did. But as they got in there and started figuring that out, we started getting calls from our stakeholders, industry groups, primarily the Texas Association of Dairymen, talking about this is going to be a significant mortality event, and we need to start thinking about what that means and where we're headed with this. So, again, we not only didn't know how many of these cattle were no longer alive in these dairies, but we also had the issue of even if they were alive, they hadn't been milked in 24 to 48 hours, which led to the other part of the puzzle was even if they had been milked, there was no way to get the milk out. So they filled up the bulk tanks, and then what were they going to do? Because the trucks couldn't move. They couldn't get the tankers in and out to move the milk. So it really got complicated. And also about that time, so this is day 5, carcass issues really started being noticed. So it was just enough melting of the top layers to start seeing that. They were back in these premises, moving snow around and finding the mortalities on the sides of the roads. The snow plows had been through and moved snow around, so they were finding the mortalities laying in the bar ditches and up next to fences and everything else. The 30th, so this is day 6. Day 5 still. Rendering company requests were just piling up. So the dairies were getting a handle on how many mortalities they had, and they started calling the rendering company going, you've got to come get these things. It wasn't long after that in conjunction with the Association of Dairymen and the rendering company, they came to us, the Animal Health Commission, because of our designation as the lead agency for animal issues and emergencies, to request a waiver for the amount that they could haul on each load. So they wanted to increase their loads by 10,000 pounds. Well, we thought, through planning activities, this would not be that big a deal, right? Well, as I'll tell the story here as it unfolds, that became quite a process. That was not as simple as it seemed, which is certainly one of the take-home lessons. But increasing it just by 10,000 pounds made it more efficient for the rendering company to go get this stuff. It meant that they could send all of their trucks to one place and get everything and not have to backtrack to the same premises multiple times. So that was an important piece to the recovery efforts at these dairies. Certainly the 30th proved to be a very busy day at the Animal Health Commission in terms of emergency management. That's a really tough time anywhere to start launching into major activities between Christmas and New Year's. But our staff was up and going, and in addition to making the request to the governor's office for the weight variance, we were beginning the conversations with the Texas Division of Emergency Management, the Department of Public Safety, Department of Motor Vehicles to work on that request. We're also engaging our stakeholder partners to industry partners to find out what did the picture actually look like. We realized pretty quickly that as we were engaged with the emergency management folks and the industry folks, that there was a pretty significant disconnect. By this point in the time in the storm recovery, the people issues were pretty much resolved. There was one town that still had some power issues, but pretty much everything else was restored. The shelters were closed, the major highways were open. People who had been in shelters were back on their way to wherever they were headed. So that was kind of resolved, and the emergency management community was beginning to stand down. And about this time is when we were starting to ramp up with these animal issues. And so that was one of the challenges, certainly, as we got into this, that there was a disconnect between what was going on in our world and what was going on in theirs. So one of the things that we certainly realized needed to happen pretty quickly was a point of communication to get everybody at the table to have a discussion about what was going on, to increase awareness. And we did that by establishing a 3:30 afternoon phone call with all the people involved. And as we'll talk about some more, that included people who weren't traditionally involved in these types of conversations. The other thing that was going on in relation to that request for the variance, again, we thought that was an easy, done deal. Call the governor's office and say, yeah, no big deal, just move on with it. Well, there was no declaration from the governor for an emergency. And so what we found out eventually was that because of that, there could be no waiver to regulations. Well, that really complicated things, because we thought something that would be really simple and quick, that turned into a 2-day ordeal to get that accomplished. And ultimately what happened there was we ended up with a variance, and I'll talk about that but in just a second. That was late New Year's Eve. So New Year's Eve, we're still continuing those discussions. We're trying to get people to the table to talk about what's going on. We finally had some numbers, at least in terms of what the estimated losses were for dairy cows, feed yards, and stocker cattle. Still had no idea at the calf ranches. A lot of the calf ranches at this point still were not accessible. As it turned out, many of the calf ranches were covered beyond hutch height with snow, which actually proved to be a benefit for the animals because they got insulated down in there, and it was surprising the number of calves that survived that episode because they were insulated in the snow. So, but again, the numbers are pretty significant there when you start thinking about, well, what are the carcass disposal issues going to be associated with this, and where is rendering really going to be able to handle all of this? Finally, we got that confirmation that it wasn't going to be that easy after 2 days of discussion, and at 10 o'clock that night, we received the information from the Department of Public Safety and Department of Motor Vehicles that they were going to grant an abeyance. So instead of waiving the requirement, they just said we won't enforce it for rendering trucks, which, okay, that works. We'll take that. It's kind of a gentleman's agreement. That's fine. And so we got that for a week, and then they said we would reevaluate at that point in time, which really got interesting in some of our discussions with TDEM in the governor's office, because there was a real apparent lack of understanding that livestock are property in the state of Texas. And so they were talking about the fact that there wasn't that much property loss in the Panhandle associated with the storm. But in another part of the state associated with the storm had been some significant tornadoes in a fairly urban area. And so those were already had disaster declarations for those areas. But there was reluctance on the part of the governor's office to declare a disaster in the counties in the Panhandle. And so we had some interesting discussions, a lot of learning curve there for some folks to figure out that this is a real issue. And certainly the county judges and local emergency managers got interested in this in the counties where agriculture is the base of the economy. So this will be an ongoing issue to move forward. So again, another daily call to talk about where we were and what was going on. So January 2nd, we're into day 8 at this point. We're really getting a lot more increased calls about wandering strays, especially in the southern piece of the Panhandle, southwestern part of the Panhandle. And we realized that people were calling in trying to figure out, hey, I've got 10 head of cows or steers in my backyard. What do I need to do with these things? Who they belong to? Who's going to come get them? And so our Joint Information Center put out a contact information for both TSCRA, Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, and Animal Health Commission contact points to help people get information about who those cattle belong to and what the plan was to get them back to where they belong. The other piece that goes with that was they were beginning to find and uncover these carcasses that had ID. Well, a lot of these stocker cattle especially are insured, kind of like the feed yard animals. And so that getting that ID captured off those carcasses was important for insurance purposes so that the producers could get information out of that. That we needed to get numbers to the veterinary community so they could go do the required post-mortem examinations to be able to get the money out of the insurance companies. So that was another piece that we had to involve pretty quickly, was the local veterinary community to determine if they had enough of what they needed to do that. Another piece that came up in discussion was people were putting cattle into local producers' pastures and they were feeding them hay because they had to feed them something. And then the question came up, well, who's going to pay for the hay that I'm feeding to these animals that I need for my cows? So anyway, that's all interesting stuff. So anyway, by the day 9 on January the 3rd, the good news was that the milk movement was back up about 90%. So the continuity of operations for the dairies was well underway. Stray issues were ongoing all over the Panhandle, but especially in that area southwest of Lubbock. And day 10 came around. It had begun to warm up at this point. Rendering was far beyond their capacity. The first limiting factor for the rendering piece was the amount that they could haul. Well, we got that fixed. The next limiting piece for them was being able to get those animals, those carcasses, skinned fast enough to get them to the point that they could enter the rendering process. So what they started doing was sending those loads of carcasses to multiple points in the state to skinning operations to get it to the point that they could get that product back to the Panhandle to enter the rendering process. The other thing that was neat about the industry, the rendering industry, was we have one fairly large rendering operation in the Panhandle, but they work cooperatively with the smaller rendering companies to farm out some of that material and help them with their burden. So that was nice to see the cooperation there. The other piece that came along there was rendering really going to be able to handle this? And obviously there were a lot of concerns. The carcasses were getting to the point where it was getting difficult to get them loaded and some things like that. So landfilling came up. Well, then the question came up again, well, who's going to pay for that? And what capacity do we have to even accomplish that? So as it turned out, this was not a declared emergency. Still, we're not at a declared emergency stage. So ultimately, who was going to pay for that was the producer. And so we had to work through that. There were some programs we found out that there were potentially some monies available through Farm Services Administration. So that was one of the outside-the-box type people that we don't typically include in the emergency response discussions. But certainly we brought them to the table and had a conference call with them in industry to facilitate that discussion on what the options were. Is it going to work for you or not? And can you get this information out to your producers? So in terms of capacity, we actually found out that there's a landfill in the Texas Panhandle that has a capacity for several million head. We thought, yay, we've got this licked. We're going to figure this out. Well, the next piece kind of squelched the excitement pretty quickly when they said, but we can only daily take 50,000 pounds. Well, when you're talking about adult dairy cattle and fed steers, that 50,000 pounds gets you about a truckload, as long as it's not a heavy truckload. So you start doing the math and going, oh, that's not really that good of an option. So moving on, day 12, we talked to Department of Public Safety and Department of Motor Vehicles and extended the abeyance for another week to get past the hump there. And at this point, the industries were beginning to have the discussions about the ongoing production losses, especially the ones from secondary disease processes, pneumonias, gastroenteritis issues, and disruptions in terms of feed intake and things like that. So not only the cows that had mastitis, but the cows that went dry because they didn't get milked, and now they're instead of being in the milking string, they're in the dry lot. So you start thinking about all these secondary things that go with this, and it's we don't know what the true cost of this is yet. By day 20, we had some final numbers there, or pretty final numbers. There may be some updated ones to come yet, but this puts us around 30,000 head. Figured 8 to 10,000 head at the calf ranches, and the other earlier numbers, estimations were pretty close in terms of what the losses were. And again, we still don't know what the final economic picture is going to look like, especially for some of these dairies that they lost significant numbers of their milking cows for at least the better part of a year until they can get another calf out of them and get them back into the milking string. So by day 24, rendering was about done. They couldn't pick up anything else, so we started with on-site burial and landfilling. So that's a long diatribe to get to the slide that really we could spend 2 or 3 hours talking about pretty easily. But certainly wanted to point out some of the bigger lessons learned and just some general concepts associated with that. If nothing else, one of the biggest things that came out of this event was a greater appreciation for animal issues in emergency situations, especially natural disasters. In Texas, we have not dealt with an animal disaster of this magnitude, and we have not had high path AI. And as has already been pointed out, there's a big difference in a chicken and a full-grown Holstein cow, especially 30,000 of them. So you start thinking about some of those issues. For sure, the local emergency management county judges, where the agriculture and dairies maybe are the biggest base to their economy, are certainly more aware of the fact that these animals are property and that there's a value that goes with that, and that lends itself to being able to put up the numbers to say, hey, we do have a significant loss in this county, and we should be eligible for some declarations in that aspect. So, but even with the state level emergency management, we work with them all the time, right? We're a state agency. We work with state level emergency management to do planning and have those discussions about the what ifs. But truly, until this happened, they didn't have an appreciation for what this could actually mean and the impact it has. As I mentioned, the human issues, the people issues were kind of already wrapped up. They were, headed to the ski slopes for New Year's Eve and stuff, and that's when our numbers started coming in, and the impacts from this storm started becoming apparent. And so there was a pretty rapid learning curve there, a pretty steep learning curve for some of these folks to get engaged and get on the right page, or get on the page anyway. I don't know if it's the right page. If we have to do this again, I guess we'll know. But and again, state agencies and offices, same thing. We've had a pretty significant turnover in the last year in our elected officials in terms of Commissioner of Ag and Governor and some of those key positions like that. That their staffs weren't up to speed necessarily with some of the aspects of animal issues and emergency management and some of the impacts there. So how-tos that came out of this, there were a lot of those, but two of the big ones, again, talking to the county judges and trying to work with state-level emergency management to let's bridge this gap about local declarations when it's not a people incident. That was one of the things. We had to have a conference call with 3 of the county judges and say, you need to do a declaration for your county for this incident so that you can send that to the governor's office to help grease the wheels to get this deal done for the rendering company. So some of that discussion, again, a big part of it's going to come out of this is the regulatory waivers and abeyances, that whole protocol and process, not just from a legal aspect, but from a realistic and applied aspect. How do we really get that done? This scenario incident certainly tested how we did that, and moving forward, we'll try to get some things in place to make that easier. Again, an opportunity to really examine large-scale carcass disposal. this is really kind of fortuitous in terms of planning. It's not at all fortuitous in terms of what happened. But in terms of planning and discussion, it kind of fits into some of the things that are going on in the Panhandle with preparing for and planning activities related to disease outbreaks. This really gave us an idea and pushed us to have some of the conversations and build some trust with some entities and say, okay, look, you've got to tell us. What are your capabilities? What are your capacities? If it was 100,000 head, what are we going to be looking at? And not only to have it with those entities, private entities, but have it with other state agencies too, and go, okay, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, what's going to happen if we really have to come down to this and bury a bunch of these animals in place? So lastly, but certainly not least, and we talk about this in a lot of aspects of what we do, but coordination and communication. This was definitely one of the biggest, in my opinion, things that went well with this event. Is truly our emergency management director, Jeff Turner, and his staff, and our field staff out there in the Panhandle truly took this to heart and took on the responsibility of being those people and the points of contact and the coordinators for activities. We very rapidly stood up that conference call, daily conference call. That was the one big call where everybody was at the table and heard the same message, but that doesn't begin to include the number of hours spent on conference calls with specific groups to talk about specific problems or issues, like getting the dairy, the cattle feeders and the dairymen together with Farm Services Administration to talk about, what's going to happen when we have to start taking things to landfills. What are the options? All of those different types of things that were going on the side. And also getting all of the players involved. Again, not only did we get Farm Services Administration to the table and have them help us with some information, but we had Extension at the table, which is one of our normal people. But through them, we also got a mental health, behavioral health expertise to the table to help the producers that were in the middle of this and dealing with this. Some assistance there to give them somebody who they could call to talk about this and work through some of those issues. So again, that was certainly, in my opinion, one of the things that went right. And again, the facilitation between groups from different worlds, the emergency management world and the production agriculture world, because it's been said certainly in our office by a lot of folks that, and I hope that everybody in here that works in emergency management realizes that animal issues are people issues, and especially when it comes to economies in these rural communities.